Hello everyone, the Blue Badger here, and welcome to the first episode of our brand new Let's Play of the mod Kaiserreich for Hearts of Iron 4. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with this mod, essentially, the Kaiserreich mod for Hearts of Iron 4 takes place in an alternate history where, instead of the Entente and the Allies winning the First World War, Germany and the Central Powers ends up winning because the United States never enters the war. And I could go on forever about the alternate history, but it essentially just leads to a very different scenario for World War II, and the in-between wars as well. And of course, similar to Darkest Hour and Hearts of Iron 4 itself, you could play as any country. In this case though, I will be playing as the Combined Syndicates of America, which is a faction that will emerge from the United States, so I'll be starting off as them. And here's basically the brief history of the United States in this timeline. The USA almost left their policy of isolation to intervene in the Weltkrieg, which is this timeline's version of World War I, but ultimately kept out of the war. This led to a victory of the Central Powers. Since then, the USA has struggled economically. European trade opportunities and the repayment of their loans to the Entente have been made impossible by the German victory. Still internationally regarded as a nobody, she now faces mounting internal dissent as the Republican and Democratic hegemony is challenged by two groups, the syndicalists and the America First Party. A mounting crisis at home and only modest reputation overseas, things aren't looking good for the United States of America. And here's the world map then, basically, just show you the differences. Obviously the superpower at this point in history is the German Empire, which now is a pretty vast colonial empire too. It has, most of its colonies are in the super colony of Middle Africa, then also Madagascar, Sri Lanka, the German East Asia, and so on and so forth. And there are other differences too. For one, the Ottoman Empire still exists, as does the Austrian Empire, but it did grant greater autonomy to its various regions and whatnot. But there's just so many different things, and like I said, I could go on and on all day, but we'll just start the Let's Play here then. And we'll dive deeper into the lore too as we go on. Okay, so here we are on the world map. Obviously, since the United States didn't enter the war, we have a little bit of a... Well, nothing has really changed too much, I guess at the immediate output. There was no immediate territorial changes since we weren't on the losing side or anything. So, essentially, the United States never enters the war because Germany decides to go against resuming unrestricted submarine warfare. And that pretty much persuades the US to stay out of the war, which led to the German victory. Just work on a little bit of industry in that here. And while I don't intend to play as the federal government itself here, I do intend to play as a CSA, and since this is pretty much the area that they're at, I'm just kind of helping to bolster the area a little bit. That way we have a little bit of a better starting position when we play as the CSA here. I'll expand the Navy here too a little bit while we're at it. Also increase the size of the federal army here as well. So if I don't do that, it'll be a cakewalk to go through them, but I want a little bit of a fight to go on here. There is a lot of lore too that will pop up in the game, but I'll give a brief summary of the lore that pops up for the other countries and around the world, depending on if it impacts us or not, but for all the stuff with the United States, I will pretty much read the description that's given to us. And here's the first little bit for the United States. The United States in 1936. In 1936, the United States of America is gripped by unrelenting crisis. Although able to avoid the horrors of the Weltkrieg, which allowed its prosperity to continue well into the 1920s, German victory in the Weltkrieg, followed by the French and British revolutions, led to the Wall Street crash of 1925. This sent the United States spiraling into the Great Depression and allowed the Berlin stock market to take its place at the forefront of the world economy. The election of Herbert Hoover in 1928, while initially promising, failed entirely to reverse the decline of the American economy. And by 1936, the country had spent over a decade in the midst of the worst financial crisis it had ever seen. This fueled the rise of radical parties in America, from the far-left Socialist Party of America to the far-right America First Party. Hoover's contentious re-election by means of the House of Representatives in 1932 and the ongoing Great Depression means that these problems are unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. Many throughout the country fear that the upheaval that would result should one of the extreme parties come to power, or should the Great Depression continue unabated. God save America, indeed. But yeah, essentially, we're starting off in a pretty poor position because we're still in the grips of the Great Depression. And one of the other differences, too, is that FDR actually succumbed to polio, hence why Herbert Hoover is still president in this timeline. And we'll start things off here with the focuses by reintroducing the Gardner-Wagner Bill. While originally vetoed in 1932, the economic situation in America has deteriorated to the point where unemployment relief efforts are seen as the only way to prevent widespread collapse. President Hoover has indicated to the Democrats in Congress that this time he will not veto the Gardner-Wagner relief bill. And it'll be put onto the floor, with it being reintroduced. With assurances made by President Hoover, unlike in 1932, this time he will not veto the bill. Democratic Senator Robert Wagner and Speaker of the House John Nancy Garner have reintroduced their unemployment relief legislation package. Many in Congress feel that the package does not go nearly far enough, while others wonder how America, in the midst of a massive economic crisis, will possibly ever pay for it. The presence of senators from the AFP and the SPA also complicates things immensely. Even with Hoover's pledge, it is unknown if the bill has any real chance of passing. And we will see. Before, I'd also mentioned, too, that there were revolutions in Britain and France, which is pretty true. It's that since the Germans won, they were able to take down the... Actually, this is perfect timing here. This one here, though, is basically just talking about voting rights in legation cities, which is basically just a series of large cities in China which are directed by the major world powers. But let's leave that there. But this one kind of goes into what I was talking about, of how the Russian Revolution was put down by the Germans. The assassination of President Kerensky. Kerensky has just been shot and killed while on the way to the Senate. The assailant was taken down by the police, but the goals and intentions of the attacker are unknown. Despite his massive unpopularity among the Russian people due to botched land reform and ineffective rule, Kerensky was nevertheless able to hold the country together for years, and his death has thrown Russia into chaos. The senators are already discussing a possible replacement to Kerensky. New coalitions are being formed, both between the left and the right, while military men like Denikin, Wrangel, and Kornilov are just one step away from intervening to dissolve democracy and save Mother Russia. How barbaric. So yeah, this assassination pretty much puts Russia on a very unpredictable course. Like, revolution could unfold, or military dictatorship. But yeah, since the Russian Revolution was put down, figures like Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky were all pretty much killed in the resulting aftermath. But even though that one was put down, revolutions in other parts of Europe, such as France and the UK, prevailed. And then supporters of Long and Reed are demanding change, which is essentially both parties are basically complaining that doesn't go far enough, and the establishment is kind of pissed about it too. Yeah, I'm just gonna ignore that. So yeah, essentially, communists, or as they're called in this timeline, syndicalists, have taken over the well, it's now known as the Communist, but it was the French Republic, and the French Republic's government has gone to exile then in North Africa. And then in the UK, we have the Union of Britain, and this actually forced the monarchy to flee over to Canada. And with the head cut off the snake, the British Empire basically collapsed. There are various other points here too. And then I kind of briefly mentioned it too. One of the last updates that the mod authors did was to revamp pretty much the entirety of China. And it's pretty interesting what they did there. Still not entirely certain about it, but hopefully at some point I'll be able to better understand it so I can explain it, but this is kind of good to know. The Totalist Charter. Mussolini, Valois, Ultramare, and other interested parties arrived in Birmingham today to discuss their common ground. It has been agreed that Marxism, I honestly don't know how to pronounce that, and National Syndicalism all share basic principles of the state's primacy in the socialist struggle, the role of national identity within the state, and the importance of a strong central authority to preserve and build socialism. The Charter also claims that the socialist state is the final stage of human development, and that democracy is not necessary to achieve socialism. These statements have drawn great criticism from other socialist factions, who gave it the name totalism, as a place on totalitarian socialism. Or in other words, basically communism like that in the Soviet Union, North Korea, and other communist states such as those. Which has been equally accepted by Mosley, who added it to the manifesto's name, attributing it to total commitment to socialism. People must reject this madness. Yeah, for the syndicalist factions, there are essentially three of them. There's totalism, like I mentioned, but then there's also radical socialists, which is basically, essentially what democratic socialism is, kind of like what Bernie Sanders is going for, and then syndicalism, which is pretty much the equivalent of anarchy and democracy, kind of. I don't really know if that's the exact way to go for it, but that's kind of how it goes. And then we have Edward VIII being crowned as King of Great Britain. It's that while George V was a king before, he obviously passed away, so it's inherited by Edward VIII, who has pretty much made it his goal to reconquer the British Isles in the name of his father. And he's pretty good among the British exiles. Yeah, things are definitely going to be a little boring here at first. But eventually things will heat up a little bit, especially once we get later into the year. Oh, and we have senators breaking ranks. After weeks of negotiations, a number of establishment senators have broken ranks over the coming vote on the Garner-Wagner bill. Most notably Robert Wagner, one of the bill's proposers, who says he will not vote on the bill unless protections for the federal or in Afghanistan for the federal unemployment insurance are re-added. Many other Democrats and Republican senators are concerned about the influence of the AFP and the SPA. They claim they will not vote for the bill if any concessions are made to either group, though others say that not supporting either the AFP or SPA will make the passage difficult, if not impossible. President Hoover will need to intervene in order to save the bill. So then we have the choice to support the establishment, the AFP, or the SPA. And I'm gonna go with support the AFP. Yeah, essentially we have the Fifth Anglo-Afghan War. So after the British Empire collapsed, the Afghanis basically took the initiative to take some land away from what remains of British India. And now they're taking the opportunity to try to take more again with the king's recent passing, but who knows if that'll happen. And the Travelers were elected in France. They're essentially the main syndicalist faction in the Commune of France here, and basically they've elected a new leader for themselves, but they still remain in power. It'll be interesting to see how the other main syndicalist nations over in Europe go. And coalition ticket. The 1936 election is looking to be one of the most contentious in American history. Many politicians within the upper circle of the Republican and Democratic parties fear that a victory by the Socialist Party of America or the America First Party would mean the end of America and the American way of life. In order to avoid this, a plan has been proposed within the halls of power to form a coalition ticket between the Republican and Democratic parties with a progressive Senator Lloyd Olson of Minnesota as the presidential candidate. This plan is unlikely to be popular with the lower-ranking members of the parties, but it may be the only thing that can prevent the radical parties from gaining strength. And then we have the two options to either form the coalition or basically decline it. And I'm going to decline it in this instance, as the coalition would debase the democratic system. Ooh, and then Black Monday. Essentially, the Berlin stock market has collapsed here. On the 3rd of February, 1936, the Berlin stock market stopped sinking. It plunged. Fueled by the instability of the market, panic selling erupted as soon as the stock market opened on Monday morning. It took well into the night for the teleprinters to stop sputtering out the results of what became known as Black Monday. When the results had been analyzed, it was clear that the situation had only got worse. The shock of this unprecedented economic catastrophe will no doubt be felt all over the entire world. The German Golden Age has ended, for now at least. My God. And then basically we have it hitting the United States as well, and this is not going to end well for us, I can assure you that. Despite the political turmoil and ineffectual economic relief programs, it seemed to many that as if the economy of the United States might finally be undergoing a slow recovery after the Wall Street crash of 1925. Black Monday has put an end to such hopes, and has sounded the death knell for an already ailing economy. Republicans and Democrats have both pledged to fix the economy should they win the election, though public confidence in them is rapidly waning. Both Reid and Long have rallied hard against the corrupt banking and political sectors, which they blame for the crash to happen. Well, for allowing the crash to happen. Obviously impacts our construction and production abilities pretty hard here then. And we have a notification too about compromise with the AFP. Recent days have resulted in a compromise between many establishment senators and the America First Party, with numerous extra provisions including for farm relief and unemployment protection, though nowhere near as far as the AFP originally demanded. Even so, Huey Long has declared this as a victory and is riding high in recent polls. Both Jack Reed's SPA and a large number of Republican senators have declared this a betrayal of the American public, however, and have vowed to sink the Garner-Wagner bill when it comes to a vote. And we've done what we can. And yeah, on the opposite end of the political spectrum then, besides the syndicalists, then we have the America First Party here in the United States, which is essentially a pseudo-fascist. Excuse me. And then we have this little notification too. Basically, the Austrian Empire withdrawing from Italy. That since Black Monday hit them hard, they're basically withdrawing their forces from the territory they had occupied in order to just help lower the costs. And the Italian Republic here is worried that could spell war with the socialist faction in Italy, the Socialist Republic of Italy. And then back to what I was saying before, the America First is kind of like a right-wing extremist party. Basically, they're for democracy, but under the head of an authoritarian figure, such as Huey Long. But then it also includes other groups too, from basically very large pro-military groups to essentially what are fascists. So, and then we have crime spree sweeps the nation. Basically, as America spirals ever deeper into chaos, there has been a wave of crime throughout the country. Many of these criminals are getting sensationalist news stories about their activities, especially gangsters like John Dillinger and the scandalous Bonnie and Clyde. Thankfully, the Bureau of Investigation has been working hard to catch these criminals and bring some order back to America. Of course, the AFP and SPA have begun attributing these crimes to the moral decline and robbery barons, respectively. So yeah, obviously, with everything going on, America is big tinderbox. So obviously the selection is critical. But we all already know which side I'm going to be supporting in the end once Civil War breaks out. Then we have a little bit of news here, and and a revolution breaks out in Russia too. I'll start with this here, basically. I'm not going to read this full description, obviously, because it doesn't really concern us at the moment, but essentially it would appear that there is some support going on. I'm not really interested, obviously. But it looks like the Second Russian Civil War is about to begin. Just 20 years ago, the last years of the Weltkrieg, the Russian Empire collapsed, ripped apart by nationalist movements and divided between the whites and the reds. After a German intervention, the Republican government defeated the Bolsheviks, but it appears that the Russian revolutionary spirit has not been extinguished. Oh, excuse me, bad case of dry mouth. After ineffective land reform by the Kerensky government and austerity measures to pay off the Brest-Litovsk reparations, as well as a crisis in the government after the president's assassination, the cities of the western part of the nation have been engulfed with the red tide once more. Will the Russian Socialist Republic prevail, or will the loyalists of the white government defeat the dissenters a second time? It'll be interesting to see what happens here. Personally, I kind of hope that the Soviets end up winning here, because then later on we'll have another ally. And now it's time to see what happens with the bill here. Oh, it passed. So I wasn't sure if it would. Though the vote was incredibly close, the Gardner-Wagner bill has passed Congress. People throughout the United States are celebrating this welcome relief to the country's disastrous economic situation, though many within the government are wondering, how will the bill be paid for? And this indeed is a victory for us all. And it will indeed help our construction a little bit. It gives us a little more room to build stuff, and actually I think I will take that opportunity. Okay. That'll do. We'll go with the Hawking plan then next. A junior Democratic senator has proposed a plan which would see the Gardner-Wagner bill funded by increased corporate income taxes. The plan is controversial to some, but it just might give the economy the boost it needs. So, alright. So, time left here then. Let's go, and neither side's really moving at all yet. How many wars are going on right now? 3 of them. Paramilitary militias forming. With violence and instability sweeping the country, the AFP and SPA have begun to form various paramilitary militias, which they claim are necessary to protect the people. The AFP have called their group the Minutemen, while the SPA's the Red Guard. Seen patrolling their strongholds and party rallies, these well-armed and equipped paramilitary units have already engaged in scattered, though extremely violent conflicts. We believe the paramilitaries are modifying civilian firearms, and the FBI's attempts to seize weapon stockpiles are too slow to stop gun runners. This could turn very bad very fast. Indeed is not good. But essentially we have paramilitary groups like the SA and the Communists did in Germany in between World Wars I and II. But obviously, since the Nazis don't exist in this timeline, it's instead happening in the United States. We have Father Charles Coughlin's CBS radio broadcasts. 3 years ago today, Father Charles Coughlin began a weekly radio broadcast in America. Now has an audience of over 50 million people. He is a raving anti-Semite who claims that the syndicalist revolution in France was fomented by the Jews, and that the Berlin stock market crash is an international conspiracy of Jewish bankers. And somehow people still tune in. His hate speech will not be tolerated by the Church, and the Pope is expected to make a decision whether to ask the United States government to shut down his broadcast so that his hateful message cannot be reached to the public. And we are actually going to do just that. Coughlin has become a danger to the public. Shut him down. Although, unfortunately, that will increase the FBA's popularity in the country a little bit. But that is bound to happen. And restoration of democracy in Australasia, which is essentially a combination of Australia and New Zealand. And they are... And then we have basically Romanians just doing military drills, but back to what I was saying before. Essentially, Australasia is still a member of the Entente. The Entente is essentially what's left of the British Empire as well as the French Republic. And then we have the Reichspakt, which is essentially the German Empire and its puppet states. And then the Third Internationale, which is essentially an alliance of all the syndicalist nations, though only at the moment it consists of Britain and France. But more countries will join it later on. And then we have the death of the Pope, so that's pretty terrible, but it happens. Oh, and it looks like we have some action going on over here. More AFP members are announcing congressional bills. While there have been a number of lawmakers from the America First Party in its brief life, particularly in the South, the 1936 election represents an unprecedented number of people registering to run for the office under the banner of the AFP, and just as many, if not more, nationwide, pledging to vote for them. We'll see them increase in power. And the St. Patrick's Day flood. Essentially flooding on the rivers near Pittsburgh, and will help the American people. Oh, the First International Congress. Delegates from the socialist nations and political movements around the world gathered in Paris today for the latest in a series of world congresses. While the mantle of the Third International was taken up by the communards after the Russian Civil War, and the ideological tenure of the event promises to be very different. The syndicalist parties being the newly dominant force of the far left, delegates were greeted by a military parade, an exhibition of the avant-garde art, and finally, a speech by the chairman of the CSP. At the top of the agenda is the spread of the revolution to Asia and North America, ongoing conflict in Spain, policy on colonialism, and the requirements for membership of the Third International's military alliance. So that'll be interesting. Take a look at the action going on here. Yeah, obviously, Petrograd, or St. Petersburg, is still called Petrograd since the Bolsheviks were put down, so Leningrad never came to be, and Stalingrad is now known as Tsaristan. This timeline. And like I said before too, I do hope that the Soviets end up winning a new pope elected. Neat. Increasing radicalization, with the Democrats and Republicans fighting amongst themselves, as usual. Some things never appear to change. More and more Americans are feeling alienated from the traditional Big Two and are flocking to the radical AFP and SBA throughout the country. In these dark times, the distinction between genuine social reform and graft is hard to distinguish. Those under the radical banner in their political enclaves have received some social welfare, share our wealth donations from the AFP, and the international red aid from the SBA. The party machine of these radicals utilizes mass media to a much stronger degree than either the Republicans or Democrats. It is looking more and more like the 1936 election will come down to Reed or Long. Reed is bad. Oop. And it looks like the Dominion of India ended up winning in Afghanistan. Here's all they did was take back their lost territory. Which is honestly what they pretty much do every single time.